Aloha everyone, welcome to our second lecture on chapter 12. Today we're going to be talking a little bit more about the central nervous system, which is what chapter 12 is all about. We will have a little bit more on chapter 12 in the next lecture as well, and then we'll start lecture 13. But for the most part, we're going to be almost finishing up the central nervous system today. So here are some things that I want to cover and I want you to learn today. Last time, if you remember, in chapter 12a, we talked a lot about that overarching region of the brain known as the cerebral cortex. And those cerebral hemispheres, they take up the majority of our brain, right? So we talked about the anatomy of it, we talked about what each part functions as, and it took a whole lecture to do that, right? Today we're going to go in a little bit more to the brainstem and the lower part of the brain, as well as the cerebellum, because remember we covered that whole superior part of the brain in chapter 12a, so now we need to cover the rest of it. So today we're going to be talking about things like the location and function of the basal nuclei. We're going to describe the structure and function of the diencephalon and that brainstem. We're going to look at the location and functions of the RAS, which is the reticular activating system. We're going to describe the structure and function of the cerebellum. And then we're going to end by looking at a few different examples. I'm going to give you one example of the brain case studies, one of your assignments for this week. So we're going to cover one of those, kind of give you an idea how to start on that so that hopefully it'll make the other case studies that are part of that assignment a little bit easier. So let's go ahead and get started. Hopefully this figure looks familiar to you, right? You might remember that it was in our previous lecture. Last time I showed you this picture, I mentioned it is a sensory map, and it shows the cerebrum and the different functions of the body that are related to the parts of the brain. So whether it's the motor senses or the sensory areas. As a reminder, we talked about this in chapter 12a lecture, the primary motor cortex is going to be located in the frontal lobe. So that's here in red. This is that motor map in the precentral gyrus. Remember that primary motor cortex is located in that precentral gyrus because remember it's right in front of the central gyrus that actually divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And you can kind of see that a little bit in this map, right? Your frontal lobe is this anterior portion, then you have that central gyrus, and right behind it is going to be the postcentral gyrus, which is where we find the sensory region, right? So the primary somatosensory cortex is going to be in that postcentral gyrus. It's in the parietal lobe. And note again, I mentioned this before, there's very little distance here. That central gyrus is that little tiny dividing area between this motor versus the sensory. So two completely different functions, right? Just that small space in between the two. Something that I do want you to note is that these sensory maps are really cool, right? But although the sensory maps in the cerebral cortex are very faithful to the locations of these different sensory receptors, they don't actually reflect to the correct proportions of the skin areas. Rather, the cortical area that's devoted to receiving information from a spot on the skin is going to reflect the density of the sensory receptors there. And then this number in turn reflects the importance of that body area for gathering information. So what I mean by this, just to give you an example, is our fingertips. So we touch a lot of things with our fingertips, right? They contain about 100 times more sensory receptors per square centimeter than the skin on our back, which makes sense, right? You don't go around rubbing your back around things, right? We use our fingertips, right? So because of this, we're going to have more central nervous system neurons that must be devoted to receiving our fingertip sensations. And consequently, the cortical area that receives input from our fingertips is going to be huge compared to the area that receives input from the skin on the back. So you can kind of note that, see how the thumb, you have extra cortical area here, as well as over here. You see it really well, your thumb. Look at all the motor as well, the amount of area devoted to our thumb versus our, hip, our trunk, right? Over here as well, you can see very little amount for our hip and our trunk, but our hand and our fingertips, there's a lot of sensory receptors there. You'll also notice that there's a high density of sensory receptors in our mouth region, right? The whole face region, really, we have a lot of sensory receptors devoted to that as well. So again, really cool, these body maps showing the motor areas of that cerebrum as well as the sensory areas of the cerebrum. So this image should look familiar to you as well. Last time I mentioned how there are 4 regions in the adult brain, right? And last time we only really covered the first of these. We covered the cerebral hemispheres. This time we're going to be talking about everything else because again, that cerebral hemisphere is the largest portion. There's so many different parts to it, and we had to use a whole lecture just to cover our cerebral hemispheres. But now in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the function of everything else. So today we're going to be talking about the diencephalon. We're going to talk about the brainstem, which consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, and then we'll end by talking about the cerebellum. Last time we talked a lot about conscious awareness to sensation, right? And our voluntary planned movement. So that's what our cerebral hemispheres are responsible for, right? And we walked through the different portions of that and talked about how we do all those voluntary movements. Voluntary meaning that we plan to do them, right? I decide to raise my arms up. I decide to take a step forward. That's all voluntary movement. But what about involuntary movement? What about our subconscious behavior? What exactly is it that allows us to have that? So think about that for a second, and then we'll talk about it on the next slide. So the system that allows our subconscious behavior is our limbic system. And I briefly mentioned the limbic system in our previous lecture. I talked about how it's right next to that prefrontal association area, right? So the limbic system includes parts of the cerebral cortex. It also includes the basal nuclei, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the olfactory cortex. Our limbic system is involved in memory because of one portion of it, this dentate gyrus right here. That's responsible for memory. The limbic system really feeds all of our drives that we have. So it's responsible for our instinct, our mood, controlling our basic emotions. So things like fear, pleasure, anger, they are all going to be processed at the hippocampus region, which is right here. So that's part of the limbic system. And then all of our drives, so hunger drives, sex drive, dominance drive, care of offspring, they're all going to be initiated from the limbic system as well. So our limbic system is going to interact with our prefrontal lobes. This is something I mentioned briefly last lecture, right? They're right adjacent to each other, so they're able to interact pretty easily. And this allows us to react emotionally to things that we consciously understand to be happening. It makes us consciously aware of emotional richness in our lives. And when we talk about the limbic system, the key structures that I really want you to know is that there are multiple gyri in the limbic system. I highlighted one of those for you already, the dentate gyrus right here. That again is going to be involved in memory. Additionally, we have the amygdala, the amygdaloid body, which is right here. We have the hypothalamus, which is right in here, right? We have the olfactory cortex, which we talked a little bit about last time. You can see your olfactory bulb right here. And remember that olfactory, that sense of smell, is very closely linked to the sense of taste, right? They go hand in hand. And then we also have the fornix, which I highlighted up here. So those are kind of the key portions to the limbic system. And we're not going to cover all of them in depth. We'll cover some of them in depth today, but I want you to know those different ones that I have highlighted here on this slide. Know that they're key structures of that limbic system. I mentioned the amygdaloid body, or your amygdala. So it is what really enables our body to react quickly to the sight or sound of a fear or a threat. Additionally, our emotions and our visceral, so our organ sensations, have a very strong effect on the learning process. So the ability to learn presumably evolved to allow profiting from experience. In terms of, think, back in time, things like finding mates, finding food, avoiding unpleasant or painful stimuli, right? So it's therefore not really too surprising that the part of the brain that appears to orchestrate our emotions and regulate our visceral functions also plays a central role in learning and memory. So this limbic system is very important, and we're going to cover a few different portions of the limbic system next. So the first thing I want to cover that's part of the limbic system is your basal nuclei, or ganglia. So we're going to talk about different portions of the limbic system. Like I mentioned, we're going to begin by talking about this basal nuclei and its functions. So if you remember clear back to our first lecture on the central nervous system, we talked about how we have different names for things in the central nervous system versus the peripheral nervous system, right? And one of those things was a group of nuclear cell bodies. In the central nervous system, I mentioned there was that little table. Maybe if it's coming back, hopefully it's coming back to you. So in the central nervous system, groups of nuclear cell bodies are called nuclei. In the peripheral nervous system, they're called ganglia, right? So we're talking about central nervous system. So technically this should be the basal nuclei, but I put in parentheses here ganglia because some textbooks still refer to it as basal ganglia, even though, like I said, technically we're in the central nervous system, so it should be basal nuclei. So I just wanted to note that just in case you're like, why is there this term in parentheses? Are they synonymous? It's just there because you may run across in some texts it referred to as the basal ganglia. So in terms of the function of our basal nuclei, one of the big things that it's responsible for is something termed action selection. And that is the decision of which of several possible behaviors to execute at a specific time. And it's going to receive input from the cerebral cortex and provide output to the motor parts of the cortex. Thus, that really helps to control muscular movements. It regulates the initiation as well as the termination of movements, and it also helps us to string them together. So if you look at this picture of a runner, I'm actually a runner myself, so just the ability to move your arms and legs and string those motions together as you're running, that's part of what your basal nuclei are responsible for. It also helps us to control subconscious skeletal muscle contraction, such as even just when we go walking, generally you have to think to keep your arms just straight down, right? We just kind of start moving our arms with our legs. That's a subconscious skeletal movement that happens due to the basal nuclei. Basal nuclei, pretty much they help us to do things without thinking. So remember, this is part of our subconscious, right? So think of in the game of baseball. Maybe some of you like baseball or you've played baseball. You have the baseball pitcher here that will either duck or instinctively catch the ball when they're throwing it, right? So same thing with the catcher over here. They're either going to duck or they're going to catch the ball. I think, honestly, catcher would be a better example of that. More of a football person myself. But that is not something, you do it before you even think about it, right? Same thing with think of you take and you touch something hot and you move your hand back really quickly. You didn't think, oh, I need to move my hand. You just did it, right? Same thing if somebody's about to hit you. Like maybe you're in the middle of a sidewalk and a bicycle comes right at you. You move instinctively, right? You don't even think about it before you do it. So that's something that our basal nuclei is responsible for. Also, again, like I mentioned with the runner, being able to run smoothly, opposite arm and leg. So in terms of the anatomy, the basal nuclei is going to be associated with the floor of our diencephalon, which we're also going to be talking about today. Speaking of that anatomy of the basal nuclei, here you can actually see the basal nuclei here. It is the third of three basic parts or three basic regions of the cerebrum. And because it's part of the central nervous system, again, it should be basal nuclei, but again, in parentheses here, ganglia, because some textbooks still refer to it as that. The basal nuclei, looking at the different parts that make it up, you can see everything highlighted here is part of that basal nuclei. And it has the caudate nucleus, which you can see right here in pink. And there's a putamen, the structure right here that's right above that caudate nucleus. And it's actually attached to it. You can see this attachment point between the putamen and the caudate nucleus. And then we also have the globus pallidus, which really is essentially this caudate nucleus plus the putamen combined. It's also known as the striatum. So that all that together is considered this globus pallidus. And behind this region, you see this purple structure. That is the thalamus, which we'll be talking about today as well. And all of these together, this whole basal nuclei is going to be associated with that diencephalon as well as the midbrain. Here is another view of that basal nuclei. So before, in that previous slide, we saw it from the left side of the brain, but now we're looking at it from the superior end. And it's labeled in pink here, so everything that you're seeing in pink, that's going to be your basal nuclei. And you should recognize this picture as well. I showed it to you in chapter 12a lecture when we were looking at these different fiber tracts, right? But in this case, I'm using it to show you your basal nuclei in pink here. You can see I mentioned that thalamus is right behind it. So the thalamus is right here. And it's going to associate with that. We're also going to see it associating with that diencephalon and the midbrain region as well. So the inside of the cerebral hemispheres are going to contain these several large interconnected clusters of cell bodies. Which are these things in pink? Those are your basal nuclei. So again, same structures, just a different view from the previous slide. So the basal nuclei are going to link the sensory parts of the cerebral cortex to its motor parts. And they connect the motor parts to the brainstem and the spinal cord. And some of the functions of basal nuclei are thought to be things like influencing muscle movements, which I mentioned, playing a role in cognition and emotion, regulating the intensity of slow or stereotyped movements, also known as kind of our muscle memory, filtering out incorrect or inappropriate responses, and inhibiting antagonistic or unnecessary movements. So when I say motor functions, I'm meaning motor control and learning. So it's kind of a reminder of how the brain works together as a distinct unit despite separate functions. So information is going to travel from the basal nuclei to the premotor and the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so now we're going to move on from the basal nuclei to the diencephalon. And the diencephalon has three paired gray matter structures. You've heard me mention the thalamus already. We also have the hypothalamus and the epithalamus. So we're going to be talking about all of these. They are all part of the third ventricle. And kind of interesting fun fact, The diencephalon sometimes is nicknamed the reptilian brain because these are kind of the most advanced structures in the brain of a reptile. They don't have all of the really advanced cerebral hemisphere portions that we talked about in our previous lecture. So this is kind of the key part of a reptilian brain. So that's why the diencephalon is nicknamed reptilian brain. Here in this image, you see a mid-sagittal section of the brain, kind of highlighting the different portions of the diencephalon. And I'm going to talk about each of them and their functions on the next few slides. The diencephalon is going to be that link between the nervous system and our endocrine system. And we haven't talked a whole lot about the endocrine system. The endocrine system does contain all the structures here that are part of that diencephalon, but it also contains things like our kidneys, the liver, really anything that's involved or requires hormone production. So the diencephalon is located between the brainstem. So you can see your brainstem region right here and your cerebrum, right? Your cerebral hemispheres. So here's your cerebrum right here. Diencephalon is between those. It is going to consist of your thalamus, which is right here in purple. It also consists of the epithalamus, which is right here in kind of this pink color. The hypothalamus, which is here in this darker purple color. So those three structures are the key part of your diencephalon. So we're going to talk about these three structures in more detail on the next few slides. And we're going to begin by talking about the thalamus, which is right here. It encloses that third ventricle. If you remember back to in our previous lecture, how I talked about the 4 different ventricles of the brain. So that thalamus encloses that third ventricle. So looking at the thalamus portion of the diencephalon, the thalamus is essentially a relay station. Many times it's referred to as the sensory relay center. It consists of 2 different lobes. So you can kind of see that here. There's one lobe. Here's the second lobe. And it functions as an integration center. So all the sensory input that reaches the cerebrum is going to synapse in the thalamus, and then it's relayed to the cerebral cortex, with one exception being that sense of smell. So the sense of smell is not going to synapse in this thalamus region. We talked about the sense of smell and how that works in our previous lecture, and then we'll talk more about our special senses in chapter 15 as well. We'll go a lot more in depth there. So the thalamus is going to be responsible for sorting, editing, and then relaying ascending inputs, such as impulses from our hypothalamus for regulating emotion and visceral function, impulses from the cerebellum and the basal nuclei to help direct our motor cortices. So we already talked about the basal nuclei. We'll talk about the cerebellum a little later in this lecture, at the end of this lecture. And then it also is going to be responsible, for relaying ascending input of impulses for memory or sensory integration as well. So overall, it is acting to mediate sensation, motor activities, cortical arousal, learning, and memory. It has a very essential role in awareness and our acquisition of knowledge, which we term to be cognition, right? Learning information, gaining that knowledge. Additionally, some motor functions are going to be transmitted through the thalamus from the cerebrum and the basal nuclei to the cerebral cortex. So if we look at really the structure of our thalamus, you can see that it kind of looks like a bilateral egg-shaped nuclei, right? Kind of looks egg-shaped. Again, you have those 2 lobes to it. And it forms the superlateral walls of that third ventricle. Remember, I told you it kind of encloses that third ventricle. And it looks really pretty colored here. It's not actually colored, obviously, and it's not really these perfect little circles inside of it. These are all meant to represent kind of different nuclei, and they are these groups of cell bodies that sit next to each other and have the same function. I don't expect you to know the names of these different nuclei. The picture's just kind of there to show you what it looks like. The thalamus makes up 80% of the diencephalon. So it's the main majority, that main structure of the diencephalon. And the bilateral nuclei that are found here are going to be connected. Can't really see it here. It's in between these two lobes here. It's the inner thalamic adhesion. It's kind of this intermediate mass. And it contains several nuclei that are named for their location. Again, you don't need to know the names of these nuclei. The nuclei are going to project and receive fibers from that cerebral cortex, so allowing that connection to the cerebral cortex. Next, we have the hypothalamus. It's going to be located below the thalamus. So if you remember, the thalamus was kind of right up here. Then you have your hypothalamus region right below it, right? If you remember a few slides ago when I showed you that view with the thalamus, and then the hypothalamus was in that darker purple. So it's located below the thalamus, and it forms kind of this cap over the brainstem, and it forms the infralateral walls of the third ventricle. And it also contains many important nuclei, such as the mammillary bodies, which I highlighted right here for you. You can see the arcuate nucleus, as well as some other nuclei here as well. Again, I don't expect you to know the names of those. I would like you to know the mammillary bodies. These are paired anterior nuclei. They're going to act as olfactory relay stations. We also have this infobidulum. This is the stalk that will connect to the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is this region right here. I highlighted for you. I'd like you to know that as well, because the pituitary gland is very important in controlling things like growth and development, and also the functioning of our other endocrine glands. So impulses are going to arrive from the somatic and the visceral senses, plus of course impulses from receptors for vision, taste, and smell as well. And the mammillary bodies, these right here, are going to be acting as a relay station for our olfactory reflexes. In our hypothalamus, we also have receptors for things like osmotic pressure, glucose levels, hormone concentration, and temperature of the blood. So we haven't talked much about the autonomic nervous system. I mentioned it briefly when we were going through that organization of the nervous system, but pretty much our hypothalamus is controlling that autonomic nervous system. So some examples of this, it's doing things like controlling our blood pressure, the rate and force of our heartbeat, digestive tract motility, our pupil size. All of those things are going to be controlled by the hypothalamus. It also is going to initiate a physical response to our emotions. So it is part of that limbic system. It's going to do things like perceive pleasure, fear, rage, biological rhythms, and drive. So things like our sex drive. So the hypothalamus is really important for, first of all, those chief homeostatic controls, and then which include, like I mentioned, the autonomic nervous system. So things like our blood pressure, and then also initiating the physical responses to our emotions, so perceiving all of those different emotions. As I mentioned, hypothalamus is very important, so I actually put a slide here that kind of goes over the different functions of the hypothalamus. So all of these processes are going to affect the body's internal environment. So our hypothalamus is going to do things like regulate hunger and satiety in response to, it does this by our nutrient blood levels or the hormone levels in our blood. So that feeling that you get after eating your Thanksgiving dinner where you feel like you just can't move, you want to just lay there, that feeling, you're being given that by your hypothalamus. It's responding to your nutrient blood levels, the hormones in your blood, and saying, whoa, you're full. Also, the hypothalamus is kind of our thirst center. So it's detecting the rising osmotic pressure in the extracellular fluid, and it stimulates that sensation of thirst. And you've probably heard before that if you feel thirsty, you're already dehydrated, right? But again, it's our hypothalamus that tells us, hey, I'm thirsty. Our suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is part of our hypothalamus, is going to pretty much set our biological clock. We also have things like our emotional response and behavior, such as sexual behavior, pleasure, rage and anger, relaxation and fear. These are all emotional responses and behaviors that are controlled, or at least we think they are controlled by the limbic system. So something to think about, I don't know about you, but I know when I was a student, a lot of times I would get sick either during finals or right after finals. And that's related to the hypothalamus. So all of that stress, right, is going to weaken your immune system. You're not sleeping as much. And that's why a lot of people tend to get sick during finals. We also see that the hypothalamus is going to regulate that pituitary gland via that infibulum, so that stalk that connects to the pituitary gland. That in turn is going to influence our metabolism, reproduction, responses to stimuli, and urine production. So I put most of those up here as well. One thing I didn't mention is jet lag. That's caused by a disturbance to the hypothalamus. So a lot of different things that our hypothalamus functions to take care of in our body. So we just talked about how critical the thalamus as well as the hypothalamus are for us, right? They're really important in our bodies, very important portions of that diencephalon. So obviously, if we have a disruption to the hypothalamus or the thalamus, it can lead to bad things. One of which being mild brain injury, so mild traumatic brain injury, MTBI, as well as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, so CTE. So this can lead to repetitive brain trauma. And we often think of this in contact sports, right? Things like football, boxing. So here you can see healthy brain tissue in a 65-year-old. So I would consider 65 to be, past middle age, not really old yet, but, still pretty well up there, right? And still very healthy brain tissue. So it's not just the age that's a problem here. This person has completely healthy brain tissue. Then you have damaged brain tissue of a 45. So 45 I would say is middle-aged, right? 45-year-old football player. And note these dark portions, those are going to be that dead tissue, right? The darker, we want it to be light like this. These dark portions are just the dead parts of that. And then you have the damaged brain tissue of a 60-year-old retired boxer. Here you see a lot of that dead brain tissue, right? So the 65-year-old here, healthy, right? 45-year-old football player had a lot of concussions, right? And also this 60-year-old retired boxer probably had a lot of concussions as well because of hits to the head. And if you get hits to your head, it's going to shake your brain. It damages your hypothalamus or your thalamus. And this leads to destructive brain tissue in the long run. And of course, if you damage these areas not knowing what they function in, it can lead to a progressive or degenerative disease of the brain. So you can have buildup of abnormal tissue, or you can have damage to a lot of other parts as well. And this just leads to brain trauma and hurts you in the end of your life especially. So it's not just when you're old, and that's really a point I want to drive home. 45 is not old at all. I wouldn't even say that 60 is old, right? This football player, again, only 45. So that's why you really want to protect your brain. That's why if you ride a bike, if you ride a skateboard, if you're out scooting, you're on a motorcycle, you want to wear your helmet. just in case something does happen, because it's always better to be safe than sorry. It may not look as cool. It may not always be required by the law in each state, depending on where you live, but it is really important to protect your brain because it's not going to regenerate, right? If you mess it up, it's going to be like that. So over the last decade, there's been a lot of increased awareness regarding the long-term consequences of the mild traumatic brain injury, MTBI, including concussions and subconcussion. And these are often going to be associated with sports participation and exposure to those explosive blasts, right? So although the concept that our brain trauma from boxing might induce things like chronic neurodegenerative condition, that was recognized nearly a century ago. It's only really been recently that modern sports such as American football, hockey, soccer, and rugby have been associated with similar deterioration. So in other words, what I'm saying is that we've always recognized that, at least for the past 100 years, that boxing can lead to our chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, but only recently we've realized, hey, all these other sports can lead to this as well. So these changes in the brain can begin months, years, or even decades after the last brain trauma. So say you had a concussion and you had an MRI to look at that brain tissue a year later and you didn't see anything. You think, well, I'm good. That's not the case. It can take even a decade after that last brain trauma to begin to see that dead tissue. Again, I already mentioned healthy brain tissue, 45-year-old football player, and this is the 60-year-old retired boxer. So again, not just when you're old, and again, these dark portions of this, that's going to be that dead brain tissue, which we do not want to see. So just a little bit more here with this chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. Some of the different signs or symptoms that you see with this, it can be really vast. A lot of range of symptoms here, right? So memory loss, you would expect that, right? Even impaired judgment, confusion, I would expect as well, impulse control problems. Some of these newer ones that are coming to light are things like depression. A lot of suicides have actually resulted due to CTE. We've also seen progressive dementia due to CTE as well. So CTE was described for decades in the 1970s in epileptics, so people had a lot of seizures, right? Autistic people who would bang their head, that would result in CTE as well. Circus performers and athletes in American football and European soccer. So this was starting, again, 1970s, even though 100 years ago we described CTE in response to boxers. By 2014, the list of sports whose participants had been diagnosed with CTE expanded to include things like rugby, professional baseball, like I said, soccer, ice hockey, as well as American football at the high school, college, and professional level. So these changes in the brain, again, can begin months, years, or even decades after that last brain trauma. Doctors say that playing football from a young age through and beyond college can result in damage to the brain that is equivalent to being in 25,000 car accidents. So crazy amount of damage there. And then I put some pictures here to give us examples of people who have suffered from CTE. Mike Webster died when he was 50. Cause of death is unknown because his family didn't release it. Junior So died at 43. Cause of death was suicide, gunshot to the chest. And then we also have Aaron Hernandez and Adrian Robinson. Their cause of death was suicide by hanging. And look at the ages here, right? 27, 25, 43, 50. This isn't just when you're old, right? These people are not considered old, really. So really damaging condition, definitely protect your brain. Okay, so back to talking about the diencephalon. We've covered the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now we're going to move on to looking at the epithalamus. And that epithalamus is below the thalamus, and it's a very small area, right? So you see the thalamus right here. Your epithalamus is right down here, this little structure. And the hypothalamus that we just talked about is right here. So thalamus, right? Hypothalamus. Now we're going to be talking about this epithalamus. The epithalamus is associated with the memories. It associates memories with emotions. So this is the main thing that links our memory with emotion. And the epithalamus consists of the habenuclear nuclei, which is right here, and the pineal body, which is right here. So the habenuclear nuclei, that's kind of a tongue twister, is the small area that influences our emotions through the sense of smell. And the pineal gland, or that pineal body, is going to secrete melatonin. And melatonin, if you haven't heard of it before, is a type of hormone that's released in the body, and it promotes sleepiness and sets your biological clock. So it helps a lot with our circadian rhythms. So in infants, if any of you have children, or maybe you have a younger sibling, in infants, that pineal body is an even smaller area, and it is still developing when they're born. So if you think about it, they're in the womb, they're all happy, they're getting their food easily, they can pee when they need to, right? They don't need their diaper change, they don't need anything, they're very happy. And then they're born into the world, and it's kind of like chaos for them. And this pineal gland is still very small, it's still developing. So the way that they sleep during the day, and they often wake up at night, sometimes they'll wake up every single hour, it doesn't begin to mature until around 4 to 6 months, because that pineal body hasn't developed completely until then. So if you're a mother or father, or even if you have a younger sibling that's always crying, if you think that baby is never going to sleep through the night, why don't they sleep? It's not their fault. They haven't developed that pineal gland yet. So again, it's just the size of a little pea. And it's the main one that's going to secrete melatonin when you sense light, right? And it's also sensing dark. So the absence of light, that's when that pineal body starts to create the melatonin. So eventually it does develop in those babies, and then hopefully they sleep through the night eventually. Still waiting on that completely, but that pineal body, that pineal gland, is really important. And you can see here, it says it may play a role in the onset of puberty as well. So generally, when you kind of hit that puberty stage, there's a lot of sleeping involved. I don't know if you remember back to when you were a teenager, but you're probably really tired, right? So that also goes along with this pineal body or gland. Your body is changing a lot, growing a lot, so more sleep is needed. In terms of melatonin, if you think about it, why do we even get sleepy at night? Well, it's that pineal gland. We get tired when it becomes nighttime. We start to fall asleep and get sleepy. The reason for that is that pineal gland is sensing that it's dark out, and so it's secreting that melatonin. That's what makes us sleepy. Also, a lot of people that have sleep problems, you can get over-the-counter melatonin in many different, everywhere from milligrams to sometimes grams for adults, to kind of help with that, to kind of help you put to sleep. I have a son with autism that it's actually something that we've had to do in order to get him to fall asleep at night, is to use a little melatonin gummy. So if you have any siblings or children of your own that are having sleep problems, melatonin can be very useful. If it's not being produced enough by that pineal body, we can also supplement that as well to help with sleep. Okay, so we finished covering that diencephalon. Now we're going to move on to our lovely brainstem. So when we started talking about the brain, remember back in our previous lecture, remember that we talked about the development of the brain. And I showed you that little neural tube, right? And how our brain developed from that neural tube. And then how it projected out and started to build all the different structures and break off into the different regions that we've been talking about. Now that you can see, this is what a fully developed brainstem looks like, right? So right up here is that diencephalon that we just finished talking about. Then we have our brainstem in green. And you can see that the brainstem is composed of 3 major regions that we're going to be talking about. We have our midbrain, so this upper portion. Then in the middle is the pons. And then at the bottom of that is the medulla oblongata. Many times we just refer to it as the medulla. So again, it's very similar in structure to the spinal cord. It contains nuclei embedded in white matter. It's going to control autonomic behaviors necessary for survival. It contains fiber tracts that are connecting the higher and lower neural centers, and we'll look at some of those tracts. And the nuclei are going to be associated with 10 out of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So the majority of those cranial nerves are going to associate with this brainstem portion. So the midbrain, right up here, is going to be superior. It's going to have a superior and inferior colliculus, which we'll look at. And this is responsible for vision and hearing. Then the pons is going to be as nuclei that are responsible for controlling breathing. And then the medulla is going to allow the brain and the spinal cord to communicate with one another. So it has ascending and descending sensory and motor tracts. And really our medulla is also the respiratory and cardiovascular center. It's going to set our breathing rate, heart rate, responsible for things like swallowing, vomiting. Together, what we're going to see, the structure of the brainstem is going to regulate the most vital involuntary functions in our body. So we're going to go into each of these 3, the midbrain, pons, and medulla next. First, we're going to talk about the midbrain. So the midbrain is the superior portion, right? It's located between the diencephalon. So you can see diencephalon region right here. So the midbrain is located between the diencephalon and the peripheral nervous system. The midbrain nuclei are going to be scattered throughout the white matter, and it includes the corporal quadrigemma, so right here. And this is the paired dorsal protrusions. It also has a superior colliculi. So you can see that right here, the superior colliculus, right here, this little kind of bulb. And the superior colliculi is the visual reflex center because it's involved in sight. Then we also have the inferior colliculi right underneath it, and this is involved in auditory relay. So the superior colliculus, of course, is on top of the inferior colliculus, right? It's above it. So there's also, in terms of our midbrain, we have the substantia nigra. So you can see that right here. This is linked to the basal nuclei that I talked about in the very beginning of today's lecture, and these are important in things like degradation of the brain. So if you think of horrible diseases like Parkinson's disease, it's usually going to be degeneration of the substantia nigra. Besides that, there's also going to be cerebral peduncles. So you can see this superior cerebral peduncle right here. And you can see the cerebral peduncles right above or right around the pons. And these are just really 2 ventricle bulges that are going to contain pyramidal motor tracts. So pretty much these are kind of like the pillars that are holding up our cerebrum. Now we're going to move on to talking about the pons. And the pons is going to be superior to the medulla, and it's inferior to the midbrain. So it's kind of right in the middle, right? It's about 1 inch long, and you can see here it's highlighted in blue. So again, in between that midbrain portion that we just talked about and the medulla oblongata region that we're about to talk about next. So here's your pons. And the pons has ascending and descending tracts that are going to pass through it. So it's going to relay communication between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Pons literally means bridge because it's kind of like a bridge between the two different parts of the brainstem. It's like a bridge between the midbrain and this medulla oblongata. It's going to share control of the balance and swallowing and breathing with the medulla. It's going to relay nerve impulses related to voluntary skeletal movements from the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum. It contains pneumotaxic as well as apneustic areas, which are going to help control respiration, so breathing, along with the respiratory center that we're going to see is actually in the medulla. It contains nuclei for cranial nerves 5, which is your trigeminal, cranial nerve 6, which is abducens, cranial nerve 7, which is facial, and cranial nerve 8, which is your vestibular ocular or vestibular branch, that nerve. The pontine nuclei are going to regulate things like your breathing, your swallowing, balance, chewing, and salivation. So if you get indicators that you have food in your mouth, this pathway is going to send sensory information up and then potentially motor information down to tell the salivary glands that they need to secrete that saliva so that we can begin the chemical breakdown of food in our mouth. The pons is also composed of conduction tracts. So there are longitudinal fibers that connect the higher brain centers and the spinal cord. We also have transversal or dorsal fibers that are going to relay impulses between the motor cortex and the cerebellum. I mentioned it's already that it is the origin of these 4 cranial nerves, 5 through 8. And then some nuclei that are in the pons are going to play roles in things like reticular formation, and some can actually help to maintain the normal rhythm of breathing. So again, the pons is very important as well. Here you see it again right here in this image too. Again, it's kind of that bridge between our midbrain and our medulla oblongata. So we just talked about the pons. The pons is going to work with the medulla oblongata, which is also known as the medulla. So the medulla, you see it right here, it's going to kind of blend into the spinal cord. So here's the spinal cord right here, so it kind of blends into it. And it blends into the spinal cord at the foramen magnum. So you should remember we talked about this when we were talking about the different markings on the skull. The foramen magnum is that really big hole in the occipital bone that allows that spinal cord to pass through. The medulla is going to contain the 4th ventricle. So you can see the floor of the 4th ventricle is right here. Your medulla region's right here. So it contains that 4th ventricle. And it's kind of a continuation of the central canal of the spinal cord. The medulla and pons are going to form the ventral wall of that ventricle. And this also is going to contain the chorioid plexus, which is that capillary-rich membrane that forms the cerebral spinal fluid, or that CSF. So structures of the medulla oblongata that I want to point out. So this medulla oblongata has these pyramids, so you can see that here in this picture. The pyramids are 2 ventral longitudinal ridges that are formed by pyramidal tracts from the motor cortex. We also have the decussation of the pyramids right here. And what I mean by decussation is this is the point where those pyramidal tracts are going to cross over and innervate to the opposite sides of the body. So controlling the opposite side, which we talked about a little bit already in terms of the cerebral dominance, right, in our previous lecture. We also have olives, which are swellings caused by underlying inferior olivar nuclei. They're going to relay things like stretch information from our muscles and joints to the cerebellum, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. We also have our cranial nerves, which you can see throughout here, right? So we have cranial nerves. Here you have cranial nerve 9, you have cranial nerve 10. cranial nerve 12, and cranial nerve 11. We have our vestibular and cochlear nuclei, which mediate responses to maintain equilibrium. And then we have the nucleus cuneatus and nucleus gracilis. These are going to relay ascending sensory information from the spinal cord. So I don't expect you to know those names of the different nuclei, but those are just kind of the different portions. You can see there's a lot on here. Here, mainly the things I want you to know are those cranial nerves, and then also I'd like you to know the pyramid and this decussation of the pyramid tracts where they cross over. So the medulla has a lot of different functions, which is why we have a slide devoted completely to the functions of the medulla. You can see that it's really important for the cardiovascular center as well as the respiratory center. So for the cardiac center, it works to force and rate our heartbeat, and it also works with the vasomotor center to kind of work with the diameter of the blood vessels, so vasoconstriction or vasodilation. So let's say that we get a cut and we have inflammation. And with that inflammation, we're going to get the release of histamine, which induces that inflammation, and the inflammation leads to the dilation of the blood vessels. So the medulla is going to help with actually opening those blood vessels and dilating them so they allow more immune cells to get to that area of infection. For the respiratory center, the medulla is going to work with that by regulating rhythm to regulate our respiratory rate. But when you consume alcohol and you have, say, an alcohol overdose, it can actually inhibit the medullary response to your lungs and can result in death. So it can keep you from breathing. It also works as kind of a reflex center for things like vomiting, coughing, sneezing, swallowing, and other things such as like hiccuping. So with the cardiovascular center, is also going to be helpful for blood pressure regulation. Many of these functions, remember, maybe you're thinking, wait a minute, you told me the hypothalamus was responsible for blood pressure regulation. Well, many of the functions of the medulla actually overlap with the hypothalamus, but the hypothalamus is going to relay instructions via the medulla. So the medulla helps in the movement of the muscles in that area. So example, when we swallow, it's going to activate the stretch receptors to allow our throat to expand to indicate that there's food coming. And then it closes after, and it contracts it after that voluntary swallowing, and involuntary swallowing occurs because of that info gets taken into the medulla. So it's just really where that information comes from that determines the main difference between the medulla and the pons and the medulla and the hypothalamus. Also, something that can happen is, say you get a hard blow to the back of your head. That can many times mess up your breathing or your heart pumping too, right? So you've probably seen those action movies where they take and have a hard blow to the back of the head and all of a sudden it knocks them out. That's the reason for that, because what you've done is you've hit your medulla region, right? And that's going to really damage or potentially completely damage your respiratory center and cardiovascular center. So medulla is a very important region of our brain as well. Okay, so I promise we're getting close to the end. The next thing I want to talk about is not really a structure, but more of a concept. And this is our reticular formation. The reticular formation is pretty much a framework of nuclei that are scattered throughout the brainstem. So it extends through the central core of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. And it is an intricate system that is composed of loosely clustered neurons within white matter. So this is going to make up our reticular activating system, or our RAS, R-A-S. So this is going to regulate cyclic motor functions. It's responsible for breathing, walking and chewing, and muscle tone, dealing with stimuli from pain, touch, pressure, and sound, but not smell again. It's going to maintain consciousness, regulate sleep-wake cycle, so sleep versus coma. So The RAS is going to alert the cerebral cortex to sensory signals, so the sound of an alarm when you wake up, right? The flash of light, smoke, an intruder, to be awakened from sleep. It maintains consciousness and it helps to keep you awake with stimuli from your ears, eyes, skin, and muscles. And motor function is going to be involved with maintaining the muscle tone. Again, like I mentioned, it's going to regulate your sleep-wake cycle. So when we receive general anesthesia to put us asleep during surgery, that medicine is going to be targeting our brainstem. And sleep, in terms of inactivation, we have to have inactivation of RAS, this reticular activating system, in order to be aroused and woken up from that sleep. And then obviously damage to this reticular activating system is going to result in a coma, meaning we cannot be aroused from that sleep, but we may or may not have reflexes depending on how severe that damage is. So the RAS, again, not a structure, more of a concept. So all of those, that intricate system, that framework of loosely clustered neurons within that brainstem region. Okay, next we're going to move on to looking at the cerebellum. The cerebellum is about 11% of our brain mass. It is dorsal to the pons and the medulla, so it's right behind it, which we'll see in the next image, and it processes input from the cortex, the brainstem, and sensory receptors to provide coordinated movements. You probably heard before that your cerebellum is really important for moving, right? It's also going to be doing things such as influencing our balance. So here is our cerebellum. You can see up in here in pink is our cerebrum, which we talked about last lecture, right? Then you have your cerebellum right here in blue. And then here is that brainstem region that we just finished talking about. So the cerebellum is here in blue, again about 11% of the brain mass. It's the area right below the brain, and it's going to coordinate body motions, balance, and equilibrium. So if there is a disruption in the cerebellum, it leads to a loss of muscle coordination. This could be from trauma, like again, getting hit in the back of the head, also intoxication from drinking. So alcohol is going to affect the cerebellum, which is why you have that lovely walking the line test, right? If you get pulled over, they might ask you to do that because if you've had alcohol, you're not going to really be able to walk straight because your cerebellum is disrupted. When we look at the different structures that we see, or this, I guess, structure of the cerebellum, it's kind of, you can see it here down in this image. This is the lateral view, and this is a sagittal section through it, so you can see the internal organization of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum has two cerebellar hemispheres that are connected by a worm-like vermis. It has some folia, which are transversely oriented gyri, and each hemisphere is going to have 3 lobes on it. So the 3 different lobes of the cerebellum are going to be the anterior, posterior, and the flocal nodular. So you can see the anterior lobe right here. This is that posterior lobe, and then you can't really see that 3rd lobe, but there are 3 lobes for that cerebellum. It's going to contain a thin cortex of gray matter with very distinctive tree-like patterns of white matter. And we call this the arbor vitae, which essentially means tree of life. So that's this right here. This whole structure, it looks like little trees branching out. So this is that arbor vitae. Again, that's going to be that thin cortex of gray matter, which you see right here with the white matter inside of it. All the fibers in the cerebellum are going to be what we call ipsilateral. So they go from and to the same side of the body. And there are 3 paired fiber tracts, and these are really important because they're going to connect the cerebellum to the brainstem. And these tracts you can see right here, in this little box. So these are the 3 paired fiber tracts. They're called cerebellar peduncles. So we have the superior cerebellar peduncle connects the cerebellum to the midbrain. The middle cerebellar peduncle, which is going to connect the pons to the cerebellum, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle, which connects the medulla to the cerebellum. So again, these tracts are really important to allow that communication between the cerebellum and the brainstem. And after looking at those different peduncles, you may wonder, okay, how exactly does this work? How is that cerebellum connected to everything? How do we have all that processing occurring? So that's why we're going to look next at the cerebellar processing. So the cerebellum has to take in information that comes from the cerebrum. So it's going to fine-tune the motor activity that's taken in and processed in the cerebrum region. So the way that it does that is it's going to receive impulses from the cerebral cortex of intent to initiate voluntary muscle contraction. So you can see here this prefrontal cortex right here, that cerebral cortex, this dashed line going down here to the cerebellum, that's going to be those impulses that it's going to send down to that cerebellum. The cerebellum receives those. It's also going to be receiving signals from the proprioceptors throughout the body, as well as visual and equilibrium pathways. Pathways that continuously are going to inform that cerebellum of the body's position and momentum. So that's what you're seeing coming in right here in this little dashed line. So that's more signals that are coming in from those proprioceptors. So the cerebellum is going to be receiving that input. Then the cerebellar cortex is going to calculate the best way to smoothly coordinate that muscle contraction. And then it's going to send the blueprint of that coordinated movement to the cerebral motor cortex and the brainstem nuclei. So that's where you can see these arrows going out from the cerebellum. It's going to go to the thalamus. Then it's going to go to these prefrontal targets. It's going to go to the prefrontal cortex. It's going to have some back and forth with the thalamus, figure out what the best way to do that movement is, and then that movement is going to occur. So that's how cerebellar processing works. Neuroimaging actually suggests that the cerebellum plays a role in thinking, language, and emotion. So as it does for motor processes, it may actually compare actual output of higher functions with expected output and then adjust it accordingly. So when we talk about the cerebellum, we can have a congenital brain malformation involving the cerebellum known as Dandy-Walker syndrome. So this involves, again, the cerebellum as well as the fluid-filled spaces around it. And a key feature of this syndrome is the partial or even complete absence of the part of the brain located between the two cerebellar hemispheres that between the two cerebellum hemispheres, which is going to be that vermis region. So you can see this MRI here on the left. This is normal, right? This is a healthy looking brain. Over here, this is going to be Dandy-Walker syndrome. So look at how beautiful this arbor vitae looks. That's your cerebellum region, right? There's nothing here, right? So this is a cavernous fluid-filled posterior cyst right here. That cerebellum, you're not even seeing it there. So think about what would happen if you didn't have a cerebellum, right? We just had this whole slide talking about cerebellum processing, right? It's really important to take in that information, kind of figure out how we can do that coordinated movement and send that information back out. So some patients that have Dandy-Walker syndrome are going to have severe neurological deficits and additional developmental malformations of the brain, such as a degenerated corpus callosum. So you see right here, this corpus callosum region, it looks nice, right? Here, look how dark it is. So you're missing part of that as well. It's another malformation that can occur due to Dandy-Walker syndrome. Some patients actually have relatively normal intelligence. It just kind of depends on the severity. Again, this is a horrible congenital brain malformation that's going to involve the cerebellum region. Okay, so we're finally to the last part of the lecture, and now that we've covered most of the brain, I want to ask you, how do you think the nervous system responds to homeostasis? So what would happen if homeostasis was disrupted? And instead of just having a lecture, which you may or may not watch, and you may or may not pay attention to, you actually have an assignment to kind of learn more about the homeostasis imbalances of the brain. So there is a case study assignment for this week, and here is one of those case studies, and I'm going to kind of walk you through, kind of give you a start on it to kind of help you with this first case study, and then hopefully that'll help you with the rest of the case studies on that assignment. So for this case study, it says, following a train accident, a man with an obvious head injury was observed stumbling around the scene. When asked, he couldn't seem to remember where he was or what had happened. He also began to get very irritable and angry, alternating between crying and yelling. He seemed to have limited control over his emotions. What functional or structural region of the brain do you think was impacted? So again, I'm going to help you with this first one. So first one, we see he's in an accident, right? He starts stumbling, so he doesn't have much control of his balance and equilibrium. So you can probably think about the part of the brain that's involved with that, right? Maybe like the frontal lobe, because he can't control his movements. And we know that frontal region is that motor cortex of your brain, right? What else could maybe be impacted there? So maybe the cerebellum that we just talked about, because that's going to help coordinate those motor movements. It also says that he began to get irritable and angry. So he was crying, he was yelling, he really can't control his emotions. So what did we say controls our emotions, right? What's the main part of the brain that's involved in the emotions? We talked about it today. It's that limbic system, right? Maybe even parts of the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus is the main controller of emotions. So it could be those different parts, right? And that's how you would approach these case studies. You would think about what we talked about in the lectures, kind of go back to them, be like, could it be this part? Could it be this part? Or maybe you think, okay, I know it is this association area. So then delve in deeper and say, okay, what parts of that association area, or what parts of the sensory area, or what parts of the brainstem? And so that's how you would kind of approach it. So for this case study, I would say that you're going to be looking at the frontal lobe for the motion, for the movements, right? Maybe even the cerebellum, because we talked about how that's important in movement processing today. Also the limbic system and the hypothalamus, due to his emotions just being all over the place. That's actually the end of this Chapter 12B lecture. Again, in our next lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more about the brain and the central nervous system, and then we're going to get into the peripheral nervous system. But that is all for this time. Mahalo for watching.